to be here with everyone. I I can't tell you how good it feels to be back in a Baptist church where I understand the language of sister and brother. When we were attending the Presbyterian church for a little while, I was a little lost. They didn't know how to talk to each other. And it took me a while to not say sister and brother to the congregants. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist supervisor and a licensed professional counselor supervisor. I currently am the clinical director at the Austin Center for Grief and Loss. Um, let's see if I can get these slides to work. There we go. And our philosophy is hope, healing, and transformation. We see all sorts of people with experiences of grief and loss, not just loss or grief due to physical death. So we see people who are going through divorce, um, who have a family member who is incarcerated, who are dealing with chronic illness or caregiver uh, grief. So I just want to talk a little bit today about what all of us might experience in our own mental health and a little bit about our physical health and how it impacts our mental health. So here's a little bit of an outline. And I do want to say, for those who are visually impaired or have trouble seeing all these slides, I will be saying almost everything that's on those slides. And for those who have a little bit of an auditory loss, uh, uh, you have the slide in front of you. So don't feel like you have to read everything on every slide. I try to do a little bit for everybody. So today I want to talk a little bit about the brain and what it does, how to help the brain adjust. Uh, think about yourself, evaluate yourself, make a plan, take action, and a lot about self-care this month. I want to talk about mental health in three groups: men, women, and children. I want to address loss, grief, trauma, and self-care. And then something that you may already know about, and that is ambiguous and disenfranchised grief. Now, that's a lot to cover. If you want to cut me off at any time and go get a cup of coffee, you feel free. My feelings will not be hurt at all. So the ancient Greeks said, um, uh, had a saying that went something like this: what you believe is what you think, and what you think is what you do. So the church is the belief part, the brain is the think part, and today I'm going to talk about the thinking part, what you think, and the mind, brain, and mental health. So the brain, through the technology called functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, that measures small changes in blood flow that occur with brain activity, we can examine which parts of the brain are handling critical functions, evaluate the effects of stroke or other disease, or guide brain treatment. We can see how the brain reacts to grief, to addictive substances, to depression, to gambling, to the release of hormones when we are scared or angry or sad or threatened, and so much more. We can see that a bad day is not always about an attitude. It may be about your brain. Your doctor might order an fMRI to determine which part of the brain is handling critical functions, such as thought, speech, movement, and sensation, and to look for what we call brain mapping. Our brain learns, it's a great learner. It learns by predictability and habit. And so when we are suffering a mental health issue or the death or loss of a loved one, our brain, parts of it shut down. And thus we know we go into what's called grief brain. It really is a real physical thing that happens to us. And remember, we're not just talking about physical death here. So When we suffer from chronic sadness, depression, anxiety, chronic abuse, or trauma, the brain knows and it tries to adjust because it's looking for those predictable uh, things that occur in our life. It wants the table to always be in the right place in the kitchen, and it's looking for habits. What do we do to help our brain adjust then when things happen in our life? Um, well, we first have to start out by evaluating ourselves. We look for what has changed in our lives that has disrupted our normal patterns. Um, we want to ask ourselves, have our eating habits changed? Are we feeling more edgy? Are we snapping at people? Are we not able to go about our daily routines? Have our thoughts about ourselves changed? Are we handling the small uh, um, burdens and annoyances? What has changed in our lives? Are we drinking a little bit more than we used to? Are people asking us, "What's wrong with you?" or "You're different?" If they're asking these things, we need to look a little bit at our mental health and see what has changed for us. All right. Now, if we find these things have occurred, then we need to talk with a family member and perhaps uh, have them have some input into what's going on in our life. Now, we don't want to ask someone who's unkind. We want to ask someone who's honest and wise. We don't need judgment when we're having some mental health issues in our lives. Make a list of what's going on in your life. Include those very small changes because all of those small changes add up to big things in our lives. Do you have new responsibilities? For instance, caring for a child, a spouse or partner? Or are you now in charge of an elderly family member or a chronically ill person? Have you recently been injured? Are you in physical pain? Has your medication changed? These are all things we need to look at when we start evaluating where we are in our own mental health and as we move towards taking care of ourselves. Now, temporary changes are just fine. It's when we get into permanent changes that we need to set a plan of action. All right. One thing we might do is go see a trusted medical healthcare provider. Now, I said that we're going to talk a little bit about our physical health, which so impacts our mental health. A lot of physical health issues can masquerade as mental health issues. For example, although heart disease is a leading cause of death in women, a number of women never receive proper evaluation and assessment. Often women are medicated with medications for anxiety or panic attacks, where the real issue is they're suffering from AFib. Atrial fibrillation is a heart condition that causes an irregular heartbeat, and many of you already know this, and it results in the same symptoms that you might see if you were having an anxiety attack or a panic attack, and sometimes depression. So always check in with a medical health provider when you see your life changing a bit. And diabetes and thyroid issues are two other issues that can mimic the symptoms of depression, anxiety. So it's just really important to get all your healthcare providers together and talk to everybody. Be sure everybody knows about what medications you're taking. Um, and if you are taking any vitamins or minerals, that's really important for your care team to know. If you have been diagnosed with a mental health condition, be sure that you stay on your medication and don't just go off of it because you feel good. A lot of those medications are it's necessary to go off them slowly, and it's really you need a medical care provider's input into titrating off those medications. Now you have a plan of action. You're going to see your medical care provider. You've talked to your friends. You've talked to trusted folks in your life. Um, Let me get to the right slide here. What can you do for yourself? What's your plan to take care of yourself? Well, go outside for at least 10 minutes every day. Sunshine triggers the release of dopamine in our bodies, and dopamine is a beneficial chemical for our brains and the rest of our bodies. And the sunshine also triggers the release of other beneficial hormones and chemicals. Ask someone else to sit with that elderly person for whom you care. Participate in a hobby such as gardening, singing, or doing a craft. These activities stimulate both sides of your brain and they lay down new neural pathways. Remember, we want to lay down new pathways. We want to put in new habits and new predictable patterns in the brain uh, uh, as we go through any type of loss or grief or trauma. Play a musical instrument, um, even the bagpipes. Play anything where you're using both hands and your brain can cross over from left to right. This is self-care. Now, laughter. I uh, Calvin had a little joke with one of the members of your congregation while we were waiting. Laughter is the very best medicine. The old axiom is supported by current mental health research. Laughter changes the body chemistry and brain function. It increases the heart and respiratory rates and oxygen intake. Laughter lowers the level of stress hormone, cortisol. After these initial changes, a person moves into a state of relaxation. While these effects may not be equivalent to aerobic exercise, they are beneficial. 10 to 15 minutes of laughter per day may burn 10 to 40 extra calories. Doesn't that sound nice? Watch a funny movie, tell jokes, watch cartoons, laugh at your own mistakes, laugh with friends. So now you're going to have to tolerate my favorite joke of all times. Where do you put a noisy dog? Well, in a barking lot, of course. I can hear you groaning all the way over here. Use services such as AGE of Central Texas for adult daycare for the elderly. That will give you a break. Breathe deeply. Move your arms up and down and around. Lift each leg. Twist your ankles around and around. Change one thing about your eating or your consumption of alcohol. Ask for help and be specific about what you need. You have a congregation, you have friends, and there are people who want to walk alongside you. Now, this next one might cause a little stir in the congregation. Learn to say no. Saying no is mental health care. Much of, and I want to give you an example here. It is okay not to bake one more tray of cookies. It's okay not to do many of the things we have been asked to do. I was raised in the Baptist church, so I know a little bit about how we do in the Baptist church. One day, as a young married woman, I was close to tears as I tried to work, care for two children under the age of 2, volunteer at church, volunteer in community organizations, maintain a marriage, cook for family on holidays and birthdays. I think you see the picture. A very wise older lady at my church took me aside and said, "Honey, I'm going to teach you something that every woman must learn to say, and that is, when someone asks you to do one more task, I'm going to tell you to say, I'm going to pray about that. No timelines or other response. Your job is to raise your family and to pray. You are not in charge of saving a program or the world. This mental health is self-care. So just know I am not giving you permission to not participate in the church at all. I'm saying when it becomes a burden and affects your mental health, learn to say no and be guided by your body and your mental and spiritual health. Now, what about mental health care professionals? Much of that stigma about seeing a mental health care professional has dissipated. However, in some communities, it is still there. Um, Mental health care professionals might be a licensed therapist, they might be your pastor, they might be your deacon, it might be someone who is trained, a nurse or someone else, to listen and provide good advice or good references for you. I do want to say something about men in mental health care. A lot of times, the men in our lives, when we ask them how they're doing, they'll say, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And you know in your heart, you can see it on their face that they are not fine. We put a lot of pressure on men to make a certain standard, to be a certain standard in their lives. If you identify as male, or if you have a male friend or someone you love, I would coach you to encourage them when they are feeling angry or overwhelmed, undervaluated, depressed, uh, unfulfilled, lonely. Talk with them and seek solid guidance. The YWCA and YMCA have programs for men. We offer a men's support group at Austin Center for Grief and Loss. Age of Central Texas offers information, referrals, and programs for older men. So remember, when you're talking to men, my husband tells me men can only talk about emotions for about 8 to 10 minutes. You've got to get to the crux of the issue and get them thinking pretty fast. And it's okay to say, no, really, how are you? I care about you, man to man, or women for your best friend, or the men in your lives. If you begin to notice warning signs in yourself and others, such as substance abuse or addiction or risk-taking behavior or a loss in interest in your passions or your pursuits, a change of diet or routine, it might be time to get some professional help. There's an organization that's titled Help for Guys or uh, Heads Up Guys that has online resources for depression and self-care for men. A lot of times, men do better when their hands are busy. Notice the basketball courts. Men are out there sharing, talking, checking in on each other. And it's just the way we're made. Women will sit down, have a cup of tea, and maybe work on sewing, maybe work in the kitchen together, maybe work at Wednesday night supper, and we talk. So let's talk about women and mental health care. And a lot of this applies to men and women. Women, as we age, we have different needs, usually pretty stable until life starts changing even more, because our lives change all the time as we go from age 10 on through 40, 45, 50. There's a book titled Women Rowing North, and in that book, the author talks about 5 lessons that are valuable for men and women. One of those is that aging can be a time of growth and self-discovery. How do we do this with grace and resilience? How do we look for the potential for growth and empowerment as we age? And aging is not necessarily reaching 55, 65. Aging for some people doesn't begin till they're in their late 70s. Every person is different. Look at the importance of social connection. And we know that. We want to sit on our porches, we want to talk to people, we attend community organizations, we attend church. Those relations provide you with that emotional assistance, that practical assistance, and a sense of purpose and belonging. Very important in our lives, purpose and belonging. Embrace changes with an open mind and cultivate flexibility and resilience in responding to the new realities in life. Practice self-care and prioritizing one's own well-being. This is very important for all of us, and especially for those who care for someone else. About 65 to 70% of the US population cares for someone else, and a huge number of people are caring for an elderly relative, a disabled person, or someone who has been injured either in the military or through an accident. It is very important that you have an outlet when you are caring for someone else. You begin to suffer some of those ambiguous feelings of grief and loss because your life substantially changes when you care for someone else. There's a profound disruption in your patterns of living, and your brain feels it. The old patterns are disrupted. Cultivate a positive mindset and attitude. Adapt a positive mindset and attitude by emphasizing the power of optimism, gratitude, and resilience in facing life's challenges. Approach aging with a sense of purpose and positivity. And we know about optimism and gratitude. We know that we know people who are more resilient than others, and we may even comment, I just don't know how he got through that. But it's due to the cultivation of that positivity, that spirit of gratitude, that resilience. Purpose. Now, purpose early in our lives might mean caring for our children, keeping our house in a certain order. Our jobs give us purpose. But as we age, we just have to remember it's not that you have to do something. Sometimes it's just that you are being, you are there for people, you are available for listening, you are available for talking. You sit at that birthday party and you smile, and your grandchildren and your great grandchildren will be attracted to you because you are a positive, forgiving, resilient person. In the time we have left, let's talk a little bit about loss and grief. Loss and grief and trauma are normal and universal. We all go through grief. Death occurs in all of our lives. We're in this together. I want to broaden our discussion, though, to talk about ambiguous and disenfranchised loss and grief. So let me provide a definition here. Ambiguous loss is a person's profound sense of loss and sadness that is not associated with the actual death of a loved one. It can be loss of emotional connection when a person's physical presence remains, or that emotional connection remains, but the physical connection is lost. Often there is not a sense of closure. So let me explain this just a little bit. Often we have that sense of loss of emotional connection when we care for someone who has entered the stages of dementia, or who has suffered a traumatic brain injury in the military or a car accident. So the physical person is still there, but our emotional connection is not there. And our brain does not understand that. It has to relearn how to connect with this person and how our emotions will now interact with that person. Another term that is used interchangeably with ambiguous loss is disenfranchised loss or grief. And in our current climate, I think for the whole history of man, we see this in the Bible. We see that there is disenfranchised grief, and this grief affects the community at large. We definitely know that it affected the early church. People grieved and expressed their grief to each other in the early church. I have a few categories for you to consider as we talk about this disenfranchised grief and loss, because when we leave today, I really want you to have a conversation about this part of my presentation. It's become even more and more apparent post-COVID and in our current social climate. So, what could be considered disenfranchised grief or ambiguous loss? Well, a family moves due to a job transfer, a move necessitated by military service, a member of the family leaving for military service, and in some cases, both parents leave for military service. Um, Estrangement from a parent or from a person to whom the grieving person was previously close. Let's just say, things happen in families and your beloved sister doesn't talk to you for a while. Well, there's grief there. The transition of a child moving to college or getting married and leaving, the transition from one school to another, um, job transitions, or a change in your place of employment. Your boss retires or your coworker leaves. Incarceration of a loved one or a friend. Migrant families who move experience isolation and fear, and their children have to change schools. A sense of loss due to prejudice, bigotry, or discrimination. Retirement, taking on the care of another adult. All of these experiences and so many more. I think at one point I had listed 101 different uh, possible experiences for ambiguous loss and grief. This loss, just like loss when the physical body dies, can cause feelings of loneliness. It can be stressful and it can be confusing. We need to validate those feelings in ourselves and others, and we need to validate the significance of the experience, recognize it. In our society, there's really no formal recognition from others that a loss has occurred. So we have to create that recognition ourselves. We have to maybe set up our own traditions around this ambiguous loss and grief. You or your family may have intense feelings of sorrow, numbness, uh, bitterness, persistent longing, pain, uh, rumination, guilt, and anger. Once again, these are the same symptoms that you might find when there's an actual physical loss in your family or in your life. All right, I want to return for a second to the scenarios of ambiguous loss and grief. So we have the goodbye without physically leaving, and that is, as I covered, when the body is still there or the body is still alive, but their emotional connection and the support you feel with that person has profoundly changed. Okay. Um, the other type that we might look at is leaving without a goodbye. And this sometimes happens when um, the person is physically alive or not. For instance, an injury, or the person is a missing person, or the loved one has an addiction that leads to abandonment of the family, emotionally or physically. Each situation is different, but typically it originates from the fact that you didn't get to say a goodbye. There's not a traditional end to what has happened. There's no mourning period, and there's this lack of closure. Often we see this loss experienced by children when a parent leaves the home due to divorce or other circumstances.
Nancy, I know in the 10 minutes that we have remaining, I was wondering if you could take a few questions from some of our participants here.
I
And
sure can. Will you voice them for me?
yeah, yes, if they can, I take yourself off mute. You can make your question or your comment known, or if you write it in the chat, I will read that and have Nancy respond to you. But I wanted to give our participants an opportunity to uh, have dialogue with you. So if you have a question, please take yourself off mute. Then I'll acknowledge you, and then you can ask this questions directly. Go ahead, Deacon Ransburg.
Okay, Deacon Ransburg. Okay, so these are some good suggestions that you made about, laughter, 10 minutes in the sun, watching funny movies and stuff like that. I want to know, because I listened to Joy Reid Thursday, and she talked about Chesley Chris, who's the Miss America who committed suicide, and her mom,
Yes.
April Simpkins, finished up her book by the time you read this. I was wanting to are there any statistics that show the amount increase of calls, i.e. to 911 or 98, I think it's 988, isn't it? Concerning mental illness before COVID, during COVID, and about now?
There are statistics, and I don't have them in front of me. Um, I'm so glad you asked that question. Uh, with this new hotline for suicide, we find that people are calling in. Previously, there seemed to be a stigma, even if nobody knew you were calling in. And so people were a little bit reluctant to call in. Um, One of the things we're also noticing is that uh, teachers now are being trained to recognize some of the symptoms, and not all school districts. There has been some pushback on this, but there is an extremely good curriculum out there. And at one point, our own Texas Education Agency approved that curriculum. Now, it doesn't make a teacher a mental health care provider, but it does give a teacher a few symptoms to look at, to just ask maybe an extra question, because we know the schools are short on counselors, but we have teachers who are more connected to students. The other thing that I find with people is that I think even among mental health care providers, people are being trained um, more to ask appropriate questions and not be afraid to talk about feelings of suicide or self-harm. And I think that has helped a lot. And I have a personal opinion about this. I know we all talk about the downsides sides of technology, but when I can get somebody immediate access to care through the internet or Zoom or some of the other programs, I think that's saving lives too. So I haven't given you statistics, but yes, we do see an increase. And I don't think that's bad. I'm not sure there's an increase in the feelings of suicide. I think that we are letting people have access to help.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Comment?
I have one real quickly. Two things. One is the comment of, we were talking about men and asking how they were doing, and really diving into that a little bit within the 8 to 10 minutes. I was listening to a sports section where these two athletes were talking about depression, and they too have a center that focuses around mental health. And one of them said, ask on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 how
Yes.
they're doing, and then you'll get a better response than, oh, I'm okay,
Yes.
or I'm good. That was one. Two is, what are the recommendations to deal with grief when you do have estrangement, say with your children or one of your children?
Yeah, yeah. So the first part, yes. And I'm I've got 10 male cousins, and I've been married 42 years, and that is exactly men, I think, in my experience, like to deal with things and be solution focused. And doing that scale, it's a Likert scale of how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 8 today? And we can use that same scale with suicidality. So yes, the quicker you get to the point with men and women, we're all busy. So thank you for raising that. The second part of your question about grief and estrangement. Oh boy, this is a big issue. Um, Sometimes I find when I attend funerals or I talk to someone after a funeral that they didn't even know they were really estranged until other people at the funeral started talking. And that's a big shock to the soul. A lot of times we do know that there is estrangement. And one of the things that we can do is it's looking at what we want to look at as narrative uh, theory when we deal with this kind of estrangement. Go back and restory that estrangement in the terms that are meaningful for you. So, for instance, let's say that child had not talked uh, to the deceased for 15 years. That's the negative part of it. The restorying of it is that, well, prior to that, the child must have gotten good parenting because the child is successful in life, or the child is still connected to the aunts. I'm not talking about ignoring facts. I'm trying to say, look at it in terms of the story that is meaningful for you. Does that make sense? I can talk a little bit more about that.
Yolanda,
I'm
you're on
having
mute.
trouble. Yeah, I don't know if I can talk with you offline, but yeah, I hear what you're saying. And so I think you're saying develop a different narrative to address the issue.
Yes, yes. So
Okay, okay.
I'll give you a really good example. This narrative theory was invented by Michael White and David Epstein, and they were invited into Africa right at the end of the wars in Rwanda. They were the ones that really got the tribes, the Hutsis and the Tutsis and the Hutus, talking to each other. And what they did is say, let's talk about this from your story perspective of what your life was like before, how did we go through this, and what does the future look like? And they listen to each other's stories. And sometimes I think that's what we should be doing at Awake, is that we should be listening to the stories and seeing, there was a plan. This was awful that there was estrangement within the family, but what do we do with that and how do we go forward with it?
Okay, thank you. Do we have time for, I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone else have a question or comment that they would like to make? Any question or comment? If
Good
not,
morning. This is Rosalie.
go ahead.
And so thank you so much for your presentation, especially about the ambiguous loss and the question Yolanda asked about estrangement.
Yeah.
And I heard you talk about the narrative, which would work if you can get connected to the person to have the narrative. But what happens when the person is still out there? You're willing to have the narrative, the discussion,
Yeah.
having them tell their story, you tell your story. But when they're not willing, even if they are present at different times, but still not willing, how do you manage that?
Mhm. You know, this is part of what AA teaches, is that even if the person won't listen, it's okay to have that story and to work on your own healing. A lot of times people are not going to listen for whatever reason. Either they perceive that the hurt is that they're the only ones hurt, that they're the victim, especially if you're dealing with someone that has some other mental health issues. Uh, Certain types of narcissism, borderline personality disorders, or just that person that always feels that they're the one injured. No, they're probably not going to listen, but that becomes part of your story that you say, that you uh, incorporate, is that I can understand that they are hurt, but it's okay for me to affirm my feelings and how I want to go forward around this.
Thank you, Nancy. We're at time. I'm sorry that
That is
that there are
just
more
fun.
questions that we don't have time to address it. Do you have contact information in
I
case
do.
someone would
Let me
like to reach out to you?
Yes, let me flip to the very last slide there. So you can email me at invoice@austingrief.org. Uh, if you would, like, our center provides a sliding scale. We have support groups that are basically free after the first intake. We take insurance. So we're there, and there's so many organizations in town that will be there to help you. And I'm happy to send these resources over to the church. And thank you
Okay.
all for listening today, and best wishes to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're at time, and I'm going to ask that you bow with me in a word of prayer. We will close this session. Again, thank you, Nancy, for sharing this information with us. Father God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for our time together today. We pray that helpful information was shared and received today. That if we know of someone, should we have need for these services, now we will know how we can get this assistance. Thank you for all that you continue to do. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So we will see you back here next week. We will begin our regular sessions. Your materials should be at the church and you can pick them up there. Thank you again for participating. Thank you, Nancy, for sharing this information with us today. If you would send me your presentation in an email, I certainly would appreciate that. I can make it available to those who may have a need for it. Thank you. God bless.
God bless. Thank you, Sister Boyce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.